Welcome to the rocket.aero DVD covering the Convair B-58 Hustler bomber, a fascinating icon of the Cold War and one of the most remarkable and beautiful aircraft ever built. This first selection of the footage on our DVD covers a few of the Hustler's first flights in 1956 and 57, and since it was shot without a soundtrack, it offers an opportunity to provide a short audio introduction to the B-58 program. Over the next few minutes, we'll discuss the genesis of the B-58 project, its development and construction at the Convair facility in Fort Worth, flight testing of the Hustler, the operational history of the aircraft, and some of the operational realities that ultimately led to the retirement of the Hustler. The Hustler project originated in the days following the end of World War II and was further forged in the early days of the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. The B-58's birth certificates were a pair of mid to late 1940s studies commissioned by the U.S. Air Force Research and Development Command called GBO-1 and GBO-2, or the Generalized Bomber Study. These documents defined the course of bomber development as it was expected to evolve over the next several years, and a significant portion of that research was directed towards the application of low aspect ratio and delta wings and their use in high-speed flight. The conventional wisdom of this era, before intercontinental strategic missiles were practical, was that high-speed bombers would be the preferred delivery method for strategic weapons, and many of the Air Force's development and procurement activities at the time reflected that belief. Over the course of the two GBO studies, as many as 10,000 separate bomber designs and configurations were considered. One early design suggestion even called for a parasite aircraft that would be carried under a B-36 bomber. When the pair approached the target, the parasite would drop away, fly to the target at supersonic speed, release its payload, and then return independently. At the same time, a great deal of progress was being made in the development of delta wing flight outside of the GBO studies. And this research ultimately led to, among other things, the development of the XF-92 prototype interceptor. Convair's experience with this aircraft and the aerodynamics of delta-winged aircraft in general led the Air Force to call on the company to put forth ideas for a delta-winged bomber, and in 1952 Convair was formally asked to begin design of a supersonic bomber prototype. The design evolved through a wide range of iterations, but some basic major themes began to emerge. The fuselage would have a wasp-waisted appearance dictated by recent research into area ruling, which would help reduce drag at transonic and supersonic speed, and the bomber would also carry its mission payload in an external aerodynamic pod that could be jettisoned. By August of 1954, the design had evolved to the classic B-58 configuration that we know today. As might be expected of a bomber tasked to fly at twice the speed of sound, design and construction of the B-58 required a number of major leaps. The Hustler was one of the first aircraft to make extensive use of composite construction, and much of the aircraft was manufactured from honeycomb panels made up of aluminum and in some cases fiberglass. In addition to adding a great deal of strength while keeping weights manageable, the honeycomb composites also helped the aircraft deal with the aerodynamic heating that occurred at supersonic speeds. Construction and maintenance of the B-58's complex composite airframe required the use of jigs due to the precision design and construction of the aircraft. The external bomb and fuel pod were considered to be an integral part of the aircraft's design, even though they would be jettisoned as part of an operational mission. The Hustler also made use of the latest advances in electronics, and electronic flight controls and instrumentation were used, including a complex inertial navigation system. The advanced avionics systems were installed in pressurized air-conditioned compartments within the aircraft. Although early B-58 bombers used conventional ejection seats, later Hustlers to roll off of the Convair assembly line utilized pressurized clamshell ejection seats. These were designed to increase the likelihood of a crew member surviving an ejection. Once initiated, these seats would encapsulate the crew member in relative comfort, and they would provide oxygen, flotation in the event of a water landing, and even rations and survival gear. Because of the lack of room inside the encapsulated ejection seat, larger Air Force officers could not be considered for B-58 crews. As you view some of the cockpit shots throughout this DVD, note that the rails for the ejection seats are angled slightly away from each other. This was to help direct the crew member ejection seats away from each other in the event of an ejection. The Hustler was designed to be flown with a 3-man crew on board. The single pilot was in the forward cockpit, surrounded by controls and instrumentation, much like that of a contemporary fighter aircraft. Immediately behind him was the bombardier navigator, who would take control of the bomber's autopilot system as the Hustler approached its target. Behind him sat the defensive systems operator, who controlled the M61 Gatling gun in the tail of the aircraft, and he was also responsible for managing fuel flow and distribution among the plane's many fuel tanks. This was a critical operation, as the Hustler was very sensitive to changes in its center of gravity. The first flight of the B-58 prototype aircraft took place on November 11, 1956 at Carswell Air Force Base, which shared quarters with Convair's Fort Worth facility. The pilot on that first flight was Burl Erickson, who had previously flown the first flight of every Convair-built bomber from the XB-32 through the XB-60. He was joined by system specialist John McEachern in the second seat, who had also flown on the first B-36 flight. Charles P. Harrison, who would be serving as flight test engineer, was back in the DSO position. As shown on this footage here, the Hustler took to the skies for the first time that day at around 2:41 p.m. 3 days later, on November 14th, the second B-58 flight took place. Note that both of these flights took place without an external pod in place. The first supersonic flight of the aircraft took place just over a month later, when this same aircraft flew supersonically for over 9 minutes on a flight with a total duration of just over an hour. A trainer version of the aircraft, the TB-58, was also developed, and a total of 8 of these aircraft entered service. You'll find footage of TB-58 assembly elsewhere on this DVD, as well as coverage of the trainer's first flight. The Hustler entered operational service in 1960, and only 2 wings ever operated the bomber. The first was the 43rd Bombardment Wing, who first flew the B-58 from the facility where it was manufactured, Carswell Air Force Base, from 1960 until 1964. The wing then moved to Little Rock Air Force Base, where they flew the Hustler until it was withdrawn from service in 1970. The second Hustler wing was the 305th Bombardment Wing, who flew the B-58 from Bunker Hill Air Force Base in Indiana from 1961 until 1970. Convair produced a total of 116 B-58 aircraft. 30 of these were pre-production planes, most of which were later brought up to production specs, and 86 production aircraft were built. The B-58 was slated to play a role as an engine test bed for the XB-70 bomber program, and a Hustler with a J-93 engine was actually built, although this airplane never flew in that configuration. Performance of the B-58 was startling, topped off by the aircraft's supersonic capability. 4 General Electric J-79 engines would get the 96-foot-long aircraft up to speed, and the aircraft had a maximum combat radius of over 1,700 miles, although aerial refueling could stretch that range out considerably. From the beginning, the B-58 Hustler program faced challenges far beyond the obvious aerodynamic and engineering hurdles. It was a very expensive program, and it consumed a tremendous amount of the Air Force's procurement budget at the time. Further, the bills didn't stop rolling in after the Hustler left the assembly line. It was a massively expensive and complex plane to maintain and operate. Perhaps the greatest challenge the B-58 faced, though, was the continued improvement in Soviet surface-to-air missile technology, which largely negated the Hustler's chief tactical advantage, which was its Mach 2 speed. A frightening number of aircraft and crews were lost over the duration of the program. While the Hustler was in no way an unsafe aircraft, the complexity of the aircraft's systems meant that even the most routine flights had to be approached with a great deal of caution. 26 B-58 aircraft were lost over the course of the program. That's almost a quarter of the Hustler fleet. By 1970, the Hustler program came to an end. Let's wrap up by discussing the video that you can access on the remainder of this DVD package. First, this audio introduction accompanies footage of the first two flights in the B-58 test program. The first flight took place at Carswell Air Force Base on November 11, 1956, and in this footage you can see one of the early Convair YF-102 prototypes used as a chase plane on these early flights. The F-102 to B-58 connection is significant in that these two aircraft shared a common aerodynamic heritage, and the F-102 was used as a training aircraft to familiarize pilots transitioning to the Hustler with the flight characteristics of delta wing aircraft. Note that the YF-102 shown here is an early prototype built without the area-ruled fuselage. As the B-58 taxis back after the successful first flight, you can catch a quick glimpse of the tail of the NB-36H aircraft Convair was flying at the time as part of the proposed X-6 nuclear bomber program. Keep your eyes peeled for a big tail with one of the universal radiation symbols on it. That footage is followed up by coverage of the second B-58 flight, which took place 3 days later on November 14th. You may also see an F-89 on the ramp in this footage, which was used extensively in the B-58 program to develop the Hustler's control mixing box, with many of these research flights being flown by Burl Erickson. Our opening segment of footage finishes up with coverage of Major General Albert Boyd flying the B-58 a couple of months later. You can also view this footage with an alternate Modeler's Notes audio track. The B-58 testing menu has 5 separate film options. First up is coverage of the arrival of the Hustler at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base following a simulated tactical mission from Carswell Air Force Base flown by a Convair crew. Next up is B-58 takeoffs and landings at Kirtland Air Force Base in support of external pod drop testing. Note that the aircraft takes off in each shot with the external pod attached, but that the pod is missing on at least one landing. Next up is a narrated Air Force progress report on the B-58 from 1960, as well as footage of the fabrication of one of the first TB-58 trainer aircraft, followed by the first flight of the trainer variant. Our footage of B-58 testing concludes with some exciting film showing a landing gear failure on takeoff, followed by emergency crews preparing for the return of that aircraft. Next, we move on to the capabilities menu, where we see 3 Air Force films highlighting the B-58 in post-flight test use, including the use of the Hustler as an experimental air-launched ballistic missile launch platform. We'll also see a documentary highlighting the Hustler's capabilities as a low-level bombing platform. This footage is especially fascinating due to the bit of missing audio that should accompany the map pictures of a hypothetical attack on the Soviet Union. Apparently, this footage was excised from the versions of this film that found its way into general release, and we're thrilled to offer this little bit of recovered film here. That's followed by an Air Force documentary covering the construction of one of the first B-58 aircraft destined for operation as a tactical bomber. In this film, you'll see some great footage of the Hustler with access panels open, as well as close-ups of the aircraft's honeycomb composite construction. It's interesting to note that the aircraft presented in this film was in fact not the first B-58 slated for tactical conversion, but the second, because the first in line was destroyed in a testing accident. Our Hustler DVD finishes up with films highlighting the aircraft's great success in pursuing many of the records and trophies of the day. There are separate films covering the Blero and Bendix trophy campaigns, as well as a composite film produced by the Air Force which chronicles these trophy wins along with the Thompson and McKay trophy campaigns. This film is especially interesting as Brigadier General James Stewart, better known as Jimmy Stewart, hosts it. We encourage you to sit back with your remote control in hand and enjoy the B-58 DVD.